Before we start the third session, we would like to thank the Japan Society for Asian Pacific Carbonate Studies headed by Mr. Kazuhiko Tanaka, the Japan Foundation, the University of Shiga Prefecture, Eastern Visayas State University, and the City of Tacloban. Our third session is entitled Disaster Prevention Strategies. For our first speaker, she is from the Organization International for Migration, or the OIM Shelter and Settlement Program. A round of applause to Ms. Maria Moita.
Portugal, that maybe some of you know, is Albertina. That's a building designed by him that I work with him. Then I worked in a project to build schools in a developing country, and today I do shelters. I was invited to talk here about my experience as an architect working on shelter. And if you notice, I will always be talking about shelter, and then we can talk about that after, but there is a big difference, or maybe not so much, but there's two important sectors after a disaster and a disaster response, which is shelter and housing. I'll be talking about shelter. And I'll be talking about this topic on the perspective of an architect and a manager of a program for an international organization. We're talking today about Haiyan, as you know, because the Philippines is the third country more prone to disasters in the entire world. But Yolanda was of an unprecedented scale. As you know, it caused devastation across the country. It's called also the super typhoon. These are aerial views that show some images of Tacloban and before and after. And I'm sure many architects will think of the concept of tabula rasa, which is when we start from zero after disaster. And this is, of course, what comes to your mind when you see these images. So Yolanda caused the destruction of 1.1 million houses, damaged and destroyed. So that means that there are various levels of destruction. This picture was taken 2 or 3 weeks after Haiyan, and also shows how fast people start rebuilding on their own. This house was something that people already put together with the debris and the materials that they could find around the destroyed home. There are also many buildings, public buildings that were damaged and destroyed, some of them inclusive of concrete structures, such as this one, one. But I'd love to also call your attention for one important thing here in the Philippines. As you know, everywhere in the world, the primary responsibility to respond to disaster relies on the governments. But in the Philippines, in 2013, the last quarter of that year, had 3 important humanitarian crises. In September, there was an armed conflict in Zamboanga. Zamboanga, for those who don't know, is here. And we had 118,000 people affected, 64,000 internally displaced people, and 10,000 houses completely destroyed. A month and a half later, an earthquake affected Bohol here. This earthquake affected 1.3 million people. Almost 80,000 houses were damaged and destroyed, and 360,000 people were displaced from their places. And then we had Haiyan. That was 14 million people affected. 1.1 million houses damaged and destroyed, like I said before, and 4 million people displaced. So that means in the Philippines, from September until December or November of 2013, there were 15 million people affected by a humanitarian crisis. 1.2 or 1.18 million houses damaged and destroyed, and 4 million displaced people. In an event of such scale, of such a disaster, often governments have to analyze what is their capacity to assist the affected population, and if they can do it on their own or if they need international assistance. Both for Bohol and for Haiyan, the government of the Philippines requested international assistance to provide help and support them to assist the affected population, all in support of the governments, the local governments. It was agreed right in the beginning that in view of the scale of the disaster, the government committed to assist 600,000 households, which is more or less the same as families, whereas the international community would look after the needs of 500,000 households. Chris is sitting here in this room with me, and we worked very hard, and we had many meetings in the aftermath of Yolanda to help the government establish a strategy to respond to this disaster. The first key consideration, and this is not new, and it was very interesting to hear the same thing about housing, how houses are a process. We also look at shelter as a process. It's something that needs to cover or span the needs from relief or life-saving phase to something that is more recovery or a step into reconstruction. This is a phase that is immediately after the disaster. Again, when you think of all this number of people that were homeless, they had nothing to be sheltered in. They were exposed to the elements, they had no privacy, they had nothing to be protected from. So that's the first priority, and that's what concerns us for the first 3 to 6 months. So in terms of shelter, it has two primary forms, and we call it the emergency shelter. There's distributions of tarpaulins or plastic sheeting, high quality plastic sheeting that lasts at least 6 months under intense sun. We also distribute fixing and some tools for families to be able to use those plastic sheetings. Non-food items. When people lose the house, sometimes we forget they lose everything that's in that house. So we call them the non-food items or NFIs, and that's blankets, beddings, kitchen sets, hygiene kits. That includes the most basic items such as toothbrushes, toilet paper, etc. And the one thing that we need to consider again in the disaster like Haiyan and the scale of the territory that was affected is how do you get all the people in need. This picture shows a distribution that was taken by boat. And then we have the displaced families that can be displaced in formal camps like this one, where tents are set up in an orderly manner in line with international guidelines, and something that is very familiar to us that are the sphere standards, which ensure that the international community is all working under the same guidelines and provide a standardized response. But then we also have the urban displacement. This is here in Tacloban, that's Astrodome. I don't know if you saw it. Of course, all of you know very well Astrodome, and if you are here, you probably relate to this and how this building was full of people for a few months after Haiyan. So full that Right after the disaster, one of the things that we need to do is start decongesting the buildings and starting improving the living conditions to a bit of a longer displacement rather than those evacuation days. You were mentioning before, Dean, that guidelines are needed. This is something that there's a lot of work done, and there are lots of guidelines that guide us how to do not only evacuation, but the management of the displaced population, who, like you very well said, will need a lot more than shelter. We need water, sanitation, protection, healthcare, education for the children that cannot go to school while the schools are destroyed, etc. So all of that has to be considered when we're doing a humanitarian response in urban displacements and not only urban. And then at the same time that we need to be doing this, we need to start thinking, what is the recovery? What is the recovery process? What is reconstruction going to be about? We need to start thinking how we can use the opportunity to work and support the populations that are already building, like we already said, and how can we tap into that process and ensure that we can do something to improve the resilience to future disasters. So this is one of the dilemmas that we need to consider when we are preparing a strategy for a disaster response, the scale of the needs and the resources that are available. Let's play a little bit with the numbers. Looking at the numbers that we had before, I told you that the international community alone, and I'm not talking about the government, have 500,000 houses to assist. And I'm saying assist, I'm not even saying rebuild, but if we say rebuild, let's say that we say we will need $5,000, which is not a lot, as you know, to build a house. Not a lot at all. That means that we would have needed $2.5 billion. There's never a disaster response that has mobilized that sort of funding for the shelter period and for the international community side. So we knew that that was not going to be possible. We will never mobilize that amount of money. Instead, we actually got, this is a little bit of guesstimates, and so don't get too tight on this number, but it's a little bit of a guesstimate how much we mobilize as international community. This is not what the government has provided, because that's another program bigger than the one that we implemented. So if we consider 160 million US dollars and we divide by our caseload, which is 500,000 households, it means that we have $320 per family. So the question is, what do you do? To whom we give, how and when? The answer very much is about targeted and tailored shelter solutions. This means that we need to define to whom. And this is a very difficult question, because when we define to whom, we also define who we exclude. Right? So we already know there will be people that will not be receiving that assistance. So we for sure know, and we work very hard for that we need to target those that are the most vulnerable and the ones that will not have capacity to recover on their own. Tailored solutions means that we need to identify the solutions that will meet the needs and the requirements of the population that we are working with. And these are some of the considerations that we need to take into consideration when we are defining these solutions. We need to look into equity of the response, accountability, not only ours, but our donors, as well as the populations, gender considerations. We need to think on how can we boost the local economy, how can we tap into livelihoods and generate livelihood opportunities with the reconstruction or the sheltering process. How can we use again this opportunity to inject cash into the community, which is vital to support the recovery efforts? How can we all do this in a coordinated fashion, ensure monitoring and the participation of the community that we are working with? We also need to think that, or plan, our shelter solutions as culturally suitable, climately suitable. We should be looking at what are the vernacular construction techniques, because we know that's what people will be doing. They will be using the construction techniques that they know for a long time, and that's what they will keep using. And then we need to think, what is the durability of our intervention and the shelter solutions that we are aiming to provide? How can we ensure that the construction becomes safer? And how do we even consider land and property issues? All of these to promote resilience of the affected populations. With whom? How do we do this and with whom? We need to work very closely with local authorities to discuss the needs and the proposed actions. Household assessments. If we want to do a targeted assistance, we need to know who are our beneficiaries, who is going to become a beneficiary and who won't. Also, many sessions with the community to discuss the program, the needs, and what are the most suitable solutions for them. So, having all of this in mind, and again, what is a targeted solution, having in mind what is the scale of the disaster and the limited available resources, also knowing that people have, especially here in the Philippines, a huge resilience capacity and immediately start rebuilding, what is the minimum input from our side that can support self-recovery? And this is when, together with other shelter agencies, led by the shelter cluster, we all defined something that was the recovery shelter package that costed around $350. It comprised a roofing kit, if you want to call it like that. It was CGI, tools, fixing tools. It included lumber, and I'll explain a little bit more of that, and technical trainings. This has been a very important component of all shelter programs after the Haiyan disaster. I think it was a very good success, but I'll tell you more about that in a bit ahead. So these are pictures of the distributions of the construction materials and tools that happen everywhere around the country. And the debris to shelter that I was telling you about. This is in after Haiyan. Nature also suffered a huge impact. 44 million coconut trees were affected. This doesn't mean that they're all fallen, but many of them were not viable after the super typhoon. One of the things that we worked on was how can we use the opportunity of this lumber that actually traditionally used for construction in this part of the country. How can we reutilize these fallen coconut trees into the shelter construction? So we start doing building operations in some of the places, and we also boosted the local market because we only bought lumber to local markets. We bought something like 10 million board feet of lumber in local market. That meant that many of the small vendors that used to sell cocoa lumber actually saw an increase of their activity with our project. As I mentioned before, one of the components was the technical trainings on safer construction practices that targeted households. So we're not talking about trainings targeting skilled labor. We're talking about all the people, the families that will be involved in reconstructing their houses with some of the materials that we gave them. One of the things that was very interesting in the Haiyan response, and again Chris was part of this process with us, was all shelter agencies worked together to define what would be the key messages that all of us should be working and advocating for, so that the families could have a guide that they all could use, and we will be improving the normal construction techniques. So this is the summary poster, and then there was one poster with detailed information for each one of these messages. Being the first one, build strong foundations. The second one, tie down from bottom up. 3, brace against the storm. 4, use strong joints. 5, a good house needs a good roof. 6, sit your house safely. This is about location. 7, a simple shape will keep you safe. And 8, be prepared. Be prepared for the next disaster. So So the trainings include non-skilled labor, like I said, and also women. Thousands of people in the Philippines were trained, but I mean, literally, 100,000 people or more were trained under these messages. Like I said, these previous activities were heavily focused on those that can recover on their own. But we also know there are families that cannot recover on their own. So what is the type of support that we will envisage for them? So we designed something like you've seen yesterday, what we call the transitional shelters, which cost around $1,800. This is very much based on traditional construction in the Philippines. It's wooden houses with amakan walls, and it includes all the features defined in the poster before about safe construction. Is there some other beneficiaries? Where? Most of the people were able to and needed to build a shelter in the place where they were living before the disaster. And that's what we call the place of origin. But there were many others that had to be relocated, and I believe what we saw yesterday was a relocation site. This was because one of the things that the government of the Philippines had to deal with, and it was a very, very difficult decision, was how can we promote safer locations when we are a country of islands? Most of millions of people live on the coastal areas, and we also need to make sure that we put our population in a safer area. That's why the no-go zones were created as a disaster risk reduction measure. But that also meant that almost like, I don't remember, Chris, maybe 9 million people would have to be relocated. This number is not, it was a lot. It was a ridiculous number of people. 500,000 people would have to be, no, that wasn't much. Anyway, other discussion. It meant that it would have been a huge operation, highly costly, with many implications, because one of the things that the first question is, okay, relocation to where? And that's when the whole search for land needs to happen. And it happens also that the Philippines is quite well prepared to deal with it, but it's also heavily dependent on the local government units, whether they have purchased the land to respond to situations like this, and whether they have the capacity to have people move from the hazardous locations into safer locations. One of the things that we also had to work very hard with, especially here in Tacloban, where it was very, very difficult to find land for relocations, where it was the most urban place that was affected by Yolanda. There were many informal settlers in hazardous locations that needed to be relocated. One of the things that we all had to work for is to make sure that it was well understood that relocation involves a lot more than shelter, and all the other services that complement that need to be in place, such as water supply, sanitation, access to livelihoods, access to people's activities that generate their income, education, health, etc. The other thing I just wanted to highlight to you is when you have a disaster of this magnitude, what is the impact that your operation is going to have? What do you aim at? How many families do you aim to reach? This is what IOM did. In this old design, Panay Coron, there was this many, I'm not going to say all the numbers, but just to give you an idea what are the numbers and the geographical extent. We're talking about many islands, we're talking about many municipalities, we're talking about many, many barangays. In total, we reached, with the recovery shelter package, the one with materials and things, 58,000 families, and we built 3,500 shelters in 15 months. And this is the other thing that I wanted to highlight, because the problem is, and I think that's the key challenge to change the way we think as an architect sometimes, is sometimes to design a building like this takes 15 months. We had 15 months to plan, to design, to build, implement, and hand over. And we reached over 60,000 families. Because the problem is, if we don't, people don't have a place to live. It's all about what are the needs. And just I'm almost finished. Thinking about the disaster resistance strategies, because it was the topic of this conference. As we said before, we know that most of the shelters will be built, or the houses will be built by the people themselves. If we train them, we hope that they will have a safer place to stay. But we also know that the timber house has a limited resistance and will not resist another Hainan. So evacuation centers, which is something that the Philippines has quite a pioneering role, because it's something that the government has been working for quite some time. But we looked into it and say, well, how can we develop a model of an evacuation center? And as a model, meaning that it doesn't start with a place, we can have a site. So as such, it's quite an abstract exercise to do. So we developed this building that has a number of features that to mitigate the impact of disasters. We're now building one in B1, that's the location, building start. And just to finalize, so I think just as a summary of what I'm trying to say here, we have in terms of disaster resistance strategies, we have both the individual, where it's about safe locations, safer shelters and houses, transfer of knowledge on safer construction, but then we also need to acknowledge that's not enough. And we need collective disaster resistance strategies, and that's about the evacuation infrastructure, information and training about evacuation, and preparedness and response plans. And that will be more or less how it summarizes the whole cycle with the various activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Architect Maria Moita from OIM Shelter and Resettlement Program. It's all about what are the needs. Ayan. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is from the Japanese International Corporation Agency, or JICA. We may call on Mr. Yasuki Yumura. Is that here? Okay, so we will just proceed to Mr. Christopher E. Rolio from UN Habitat. A round of applause, please. But before anything else, we would like to thank again Japan Society for Asian Pacific Priority Studies, Japan Foundation, the University of Shiga Prefecture, Eastern Visayas State University, and the City of Tacloban. Of course, we would like to thank our past speakers from the session 1 entitled Vision for Reconstruction Planning. We have Professor Ubaura Michio, Dean Joseph Michael Espina, Katsuji Imada, Architect Danilo Fuentebella, Mr. Kei Minahora, and of course from the second session, Housing and Community Rehabilitation, we have Mr. Tadashi Saito, Architect Andres Abusman, Professor Yasushi Sakuichi, Professor Yuichi Ajizawa, Professor Shuchi Funo, and of course our moderators for the discussion panel session, we have Mr. Professor Juan Ramon Jimenez and Mr. Jesus Alberto Pulido.
Maupay kahapon. Tama ka? Good afternoon. Sorry, may technical problems, no? But I'm very happy to be here. I have been learning the whole day from the experts from Japan and other countries, Spain. And this afternoon, actually, I prepared a different presentation. It's more than 30 slides. But when architect Danny presented with a video from the city, I thought 80% of my presentation is already delivered. So I'm now doing another presentation which takes off from Professor Juno's presentation, which is about, Maria was talking about shelter. And thanks Maria for providing a very good, comprehensive, overall overview of the challenge of Haiyan when it comes to shelter and housing. I will now be focusing on housing, permanent housing that we implemented in Rojas City, and hopefully which we will be implementing soon here in Tacloban. Okay. So I will start with a video and then a very short presentation. Sinasabi niya. So many experts. Okay.
Support for safer homes and settlements, isang kapulative endeavor na ang pulo ang makapagbulig sa pagbangon sa mga biktima sa Miranda sa probinsya sa Cavite. Ang proyekto na mag-isa sa July 2014 na may pondo ng $2.5 million halin sa gobyerno sa Japan. Nagagawang ng budget sa 42.7 million pesos halin sa DSWD. Ang prioridad, ang mga pagpapindaso sa mga komunidad, pati na ang sinayong paggawa ng units paano sa community-driven approach na kung tawag people process. Ini nakaangkla sa pagpatibay ng mga komunidad sa pagpatigayad sa ilang ugalitin ng pagbangon. Matapos ng patuloy, 2 taon sila ang ating nasabot. Puyo sa mga proyekto amo ang mapadasig ang pagbangon sa bangkit ng komunidad. Bangod sa mga dami investments, mas nadamo ang komunidad na paitalo sa Community Mortgage Program o CMP sa Social Housing Finance Corporation or SHFC ang ginamigan sa proyekto para mas nadamo ang makaagod sa mas madasig ng pagbangon. Kaya sa target na banking, 28 ka komunidad ang naging bakit sa proyekto. Ipananaon sa proyekto ang mga patindog sa 610 ka balay. Nanguman ang disenyo sa mga balay paano sa pagpilitin na isang UN Habitat or sa National Standards ng United Architects of the Philippines kag Association of Structural Engineers of the Philippines. Sa Sininga Bahin, naghatag sa 42.7 million pesos na dugang mapondo ang Department of Social Welfare and Development. Bangod sini, naglabot sa 660 ka balay ang pagkatulog. Isa pa katarget ng proyekto amo ang mag-train sa 250 kapatay sa construction na disaster risk resilient. Tungod sa mga savings, dugang mabalay ng ipatulog at mas mapasto na interes ng mga komunidad. Naglabot sa 323 kapatay at 31 performer na nag-train. Sulusubra isa gatos kapatay at 20 performer ang nagbatindog sa mga balay. Samtang ang iban sa ilan, ang kita na sa programa sa ilang ER or training certificates. Yung pananawan sa project na makahatag sa maayong community facilities sa 20 na komunidad. Nakalikom sa bugang apondo halit sa gobyerno pag private organizations. Ang LGU sa Panay Redevelopment na kabilang sa mga heavy equipment para magtuloy sa pagpapino sa infrastructure projects. Ang BDO Foundation naman, naghalat sa pondo para sa pagkatindog sa multipurpose center sa mga komunidad. Nagbukas ng private builders ang mga komunidad para magpatindog sa mga infrastructure projects. Tungkol sa adlaw-adlaw na pagkutanay, nakadevelop sa maayo na paghampanay ang mga komunidad ng mga builder. Ini nagresulta sa bilitaryo ng pagtulog sa builders ng specification sa ilang ugrang infrastructure bilang donasyon sa komunidad. So, matotal, 54 ang community infrastructure projects ang nakatulong para sa 28 award ng communities. Apat na libo mapalimalay ang imbuyo sa proyekto matuluan sa BRR. Lagpas 170 ka household self-assessors and guiders o HAGs ang gintrain para mag-contract ng BRR payments at house assessment sa ilang komunidad. Labi na din sa mga pamilya na wala naka-avail sa mga bagong mabalay. Bitang buli sa mga kalapit na komunidad, nag-assess na ang mga HAGs din. 4,594 kapalimalay ang na-assess ng ating HAGs. Ang ulitin na tuloy sa proyekto ang pagpalaganap sa awareness na nanungod sa Build Back Safer sa local at national level. Mga pinakabeses dito itaas ng proyekto kung paano ma-function ang people's process sa nagkakalain-lain ng paano. Halin sa pagpanahon sa mga komunidad at pag-train sa ila sa isakong pagpadalagan sa construction at pag-budget, hasta sa pagkitra sa mga information sharing summits na hanungod sa community-driven shelter at livelihood upod ang nagkakalain-lain ng LGU, pati na ang pag-coordinate sa nila. Bang sini nag-arhalaw ay nilinaw sa madaming mga tao, labi na din sa mga LGU pag nagkalain-lain ng mga organisasyon na hanungod sa kung ano ang epektibo ang people's process sa post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. Isa pa ka-epekto sa proyekto, ang ginapananaw subong mga partnership sa Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council of kag UN Habitat sa pagpatindog sa mga panimalay gamit ang people's process sa Northern Philippines of Communities Plan. Bilang leader sa ilang kawalingan ng pagbangon, ang mga partner communities ang mga nag-explicar sa mga principles ng BRR sa shelter recovery dito sa people's process sa iban pang mga komunidad. Pero ang impact ng popular sa support sa safer homes and settlements ay larang malimitahan sa mga target community. Sa ilalim ng proyekto, nagkabalo ang mga komunidad ng Bunyanay para makaabot sa isa kanilang tulog. halin sa pagpanubo sa presyo sa mga materyales, at sa pag-transform sa kita komunidad din sa pagka-dormant, paano sa pagka-aktibo, paano sa pagka-sa mga activities na nagapromote sa pinamaayo, dignidad, kalidad. Ang financial transparency ng pamaali para ibalik ang salit sa mga miyembro sa komunidad sa ilong. Nagpaatang malinis ang importansya sa ibalo sa financing, banking, at pamilya. Ini ng mga ikono magustan ng komunidad maski matapos na ang proyekto. Sa subong, halos adlaw-adlaw na sila makita sa Bangko de Oro, nagkatransaksyon sa milyon para sa proyekto. Nagkabalungan ang mga tao magamit sa ilang mga pinangarap. Nagkabalo sila magpalapit sa gobyerno para mangayos ang bulig para sa pagpakayo sa ilang mga pasilidad. Nabalan na nila na hindi lang sila basta malugagon, pwede man sila mangin-malugulig. Ini ang proyekto isa kamatuon na inundlo sa bayanihan kung sabihin ang pagbangon at pagpabakod sa komunidad pinakamadaling maabot kung dokumentinay. Isang manhilanda sa mga pinakabalaog ng lubyo na nag-igo sa aton sa pamaali sa post-Hilanda support for safer coastal settlements. Nabalaan natin yung masarangan taang kung ano man na mag-aabot basta nag-uligyan.
Thank you. There's a very short video. This is more or less actually a project accomplishment video. We're coming up with another one that talks about the project itself, no? I'm not reporting. Sorry. Nawawala tuloy. Kala ka pa naman serious na ako, no? Anyway, this is the name of the project, and these are the partners. Again, we were talking about earlier partnership with Japan. This project is primarily funded by the people of Japan. And because the SWBs found it very promising, they implemented that project. So from their core shelter funds, that actually increased the coverage of the houses. The Social Housing Finance Corporation, because we were working with CMP communities. These are communities under the community mortgage programs where families have started to organize themselves to buy the land where the houses will be built. The people's process is a UN Habitat process, and this has been applied all over, no? Primarily in the Asia-Pacific region. So in the Indian Ocean tsunami, we were able to build this number of houses, 12,500 houses. In Maldives, 5,300. In Sri Lanka, 30,000, etc. No? In post-conflict projects, we also did it in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Sri Lanka. In Pakistan earthquake, we did 850 houses, 850,000 houses. Also in Myanmar, Nepal, and Samoa. So there was none in the Philippines. And actually this is the first project that we did in the Philippines using the people's process. And initially not even using government's money. I think what is very peculiar about the situation in the Philippines is that permanent housing is a very sticky issue when it comes to disaster housing, because permanent housing is not, well, based on government policies, it cannot be given as grants to private owners. You know, it cannot be a government investment on private land. So, and then there are certain policies like recoverability policies, because the National Housing Authority is not a grant-giving institution. It has to recover the money it invests in houses. So, unlike temporary shelter where it is an outright grant to families, permanent housing has to be recovered. So, these are some of the issues that makes permanent housing delivery very difficult for the country. And also, permanent housing cannot be constructed on land that is not titled, or where there is, where the ownership of the land is clear. You can do that in temporary shelter because it's temporary, but for permanent shelter, the requirement is for the land titles to be clean. But we know in the Philippines that most of the titles are tax declarations, are not properly titled, so that also lengthens the process of providing permanent shelter. Why the people's process? Because the people's process is cheaper, and we have experienced this in the project. Most, if not all, of the permanent housing projects in the Philippines are done through contractors or developers. And because these are private, these are private developers, these are private enterprises, of course they need to have profits. But the people's process, we do away with the contractor's profit. We go straight to the community. In fact, the money is downloaded straight to the community. It does not go to UN Habitat, it goes straight to the community. The community puts it in their bank, manages the money, they buy their materials, they pay the contractors and laborers and workers, they do their own financial management and everything. That's why this kind of process takes a lot of effort on the part of, in this case, UN Habitat, to capacitate the communities to do all that. Because they were not used to do that. And of course, because we download the money straight to the communities, cash goes straight into the local economy. Many of the, for example, if you look at the contractors in Yolanda, many of these are actually Manila-based contractors. No? The bidding happens in Manila. And then they come to Tacloban, they come to Rojas and to other places to construct. But they spend minimum and then the rest of the resources are actually taken out of the local economy. It's faster in construction because the process involves on day one, the family already knows that that is their house being constructed. Families don't go to the house after it is constructed. On day one, before the first shovel is put to the ground, families know that it is their house. So from day one, they come beside their house and they monitor whether the worker reports on time and whether the worker gets more than the required break. And in fact, they save money so that they can give workers cold water so they can work better. Things like that. They buy monies and to give the workers bread or extra food. And then they help in the construction. I was there one time in November and I saw a mother really doing the shoveling. And he said, why are you doing that on a Sunday? And he said, I want to spend my Christmas in that house. So they have that kind of ownership, even when the house is being constructed. And that makes it faster. It shortens. The only reason why it gets to 21 days is because of the curing of cement and other materials. But otherwise, all the other processes in construction is shortened. So you can see here, the mother is camping out outside of the house. Here, the name of the family is already posted on the house undergoing construction. It is transparent and accountable to the community. When this homeowners association, they're used to having 10,000 pesos in their bank accounts. That's where they collect from their members so that they can pay under the community mortgage program. And then suddenly, because of the project, 10 million is downloaded in their accounts. It makes them nervous, but it also heightens the community's sense that they have to be accountable to that money, and all eyes are on the officers and on that account. So there was very, very strong, vigilance in the community. It's better in quality, I said, because, the part of the training that we do, we train the mothers, the committee members to inspect the materials. What kind of nails will have to be used, the thickness of the roofing, how many board feet, etc. And how the construction should be done. They're the ones inspecting it step by step. So in fact, our foremen, they're complaining to us, sir, your families are very strict. They're even stricter than the foremen and our technical supervisors, because we teach them how to inspect and to ensure. And it's their house. So they have to be sure that their house is constructed well. Of course, we have more empowered communities that were able to organize their own functional committees. Meron silang finance committee, procurement committee, events committee, everything, no? So, and because of that, they gain a sense of, self-esteem, holding so much responsibility for such a very important project. And of course, this is obvious. The acceptability is high. They were involved from the very start. From designing the house, although, of course, that's why there was a question earlier on what's the role of the architects. The architects will have to put the design ideas into technical terms, right? Into the architectural drawings. But the whole concept of the house, the use of the bamboo slabs for windows, they came from the families. They wanted bamboo for the second half of the wall because it's cooler. They wanted glass jalousies for the window because it brings light in. Those things. And in fact, when you look at the design of the house, they actually can choose whether they can put the door on the left side or on the right side, because it's nearer for their own personal reasons. It's very flexible. There's a standard design, but because they're there, it becomes very flexible. Anyway, so this is the purpose and overall strategy. Really, the strategy is people's process to build back safer in an affordable and culturally acceptable way. But really, it's harnessing the people's inherent skills and resources. This is the coverage of the project. We work in 4 local government units: Roa City, Panay, Pontevedra, and Estancia. And these are the key outcomes. We originally targeted 20 communities, but in the end, we were able to work with 28 communities because of the interest, but also at the same time because of the savings generated by the project. We thought it would be very difficult for us to reach 135,000 per house. And that's very low. We were only able to spend 135,000 pesos per house. But then we were able to increase because a lot of savings were generated because of the process. We said we will have access to resilient shelter and wash facilities, 610 households. We were able to increase it to 660 permanent houses because of the savings. The vulnerable households will receive trainings of technical inspection. In fact, when the houses were designed, before the house design was started, we conducted trainings on the DRR. Because they have to know why their houses were designed that way. And why they're so when you look at the houses, makikita nyo, these actually are very strong reinforced concrete, but this is a reinforced roof beam. And the houses, cuatro aguas, heat-proof, they are anchored on that. So, because that also complies with the DPWH, the Department of Public Works and Highways standards, that they can only approve this kind of design if it withstands 250 kilometers per hour wind speed, and all the other PSIs and all the other parameters for them to approve the design of the house. So all of that is built into the design, but also culturally acceptable to them. Okay. We also train artisans. So, we have actually 3 levels of training. The first level is for the non-skilled, so ito yung mga laborers. And then the second level is for carpenters and masons. And the third level of training is for the foremen. Many of the people we train, well, most of the people we train, of course, were absorbed by the project, but many of them graduated from non-skilled to skilled and foremen. So that after the project and with the project experience, many of them were able to find jobs outside. So they become a pool of community construction workers. So, ito yung mga steps, but I don't think I need to go through that. But siguro yung key things, like this preliminary drawings and house designing, this is really done throughout the day. We don't have, unlike now there is, well, I just can have a compare it with NHA, no? When in NHA projects, contractors actually give their designs to NHA. When NHA approves it, that's the house that they will construct, regardless of whether the community likes it or not. The community just goes there when it's finished, no? That's why you have row houses all over, with, with minimum inputs from communities. But the houses that we built are single detached houses. And there are 2 kinds, one built on grade and one on stilts. And these houses on stilts are the ones that we construct in flood, not really flood prone, but in areas where it's below the highway or below the street level. So when it rains, water tends to gather first in the houses. And we don't tell them that, because this area is flood prone, you have to relocate. Because they, the policy of the government really, and which we think is wise, minimum dislocation as possible. You just don't relocate people just because it's unsafe. Because risk can be managed. And in fact, in some of the locations that we constructed the houses, we have to go through a process of clearance with MGB, the Mines and Geosciences Bureau, because they have to clear the site as acceptable and that the risk is manageable. That's why we have this kind of design, the houses and stilts. So community development, technical design, that's where the architects and engineers come in. So we have, this is the key. One of the key elements of the project is really community contracting. The contract is with the community. Money is downloaded straight to the community's accounts. They manage it. We support them. We have our financial officers who handle them through the project. But effectively, they manage the project. Community training and project and financial management, and then itong shelter design. This is very important. This actually took time because we had to do a number of scale models so that families can work around it and see, okay, this is what I like. Can we change this? So we invested a lot in terms of really making the communities agree on the design that's acceptable to them. So the house construction, the involvement of the families from day one, and then turn over to partners. And then all throughout this, there is project evaluation. This is done by the Habitat team as well as the communities themselves. Ito yung before and after pictures of the houses. This is the turnover. This is a picture of the community that we did it in one of the communities that we have built. So what are some of the impacts? They're now more knowledgeable in the RR because from day one of the project, we oriented them on how to make the structure disaster resilient, but also I think more than the structure, it's really the awareness of the community on how they could prepare for disasters. So it's not just about structure, it's about community preparedness. Of course, high construction quality of their houses. The construction skills become a source of livelihood even after the project. The construction cost is lower. In this case, this is an example where a member of the association actually has a space for storing materials. They were able to buy materials in bulk, and therefore they were able to negotiate and bring the prices of cement down. The capacities were built, especially of the women, because we were working mostly with fishing communities. And because these are fishing communities, the husbands are out in the sea fishing. Who's left to do the management of the construction of the house? The mothers. They do the financial management and the project management, and stronger communities, as I said. And we were able to establish partners also that bought into the project. Thank you.
There is no better way in helping others than teaching them how to help themselves. Am I right, sir? Thank you so much, Mr. Christopher E. Rollo from the UN Habitat. Our next speaker is from Zamboanga Basilan Integrated Development Alliance. Please all welcome Ms. Macy F. Tagapios. Okay, so while they are preparing for the presentation, I would like to have a roll call. Asan ang mga architecture students coming from 4th year A? Ayan. The architecture students coming from the 4th year B. How about the 5th year A students? And the 5th year B students. Everyone coming from Eastern Visayas State University, thank you for participating for this conference.
Okay, mayong hapon, buenos dias, assalamualaikum. I am Macy from Zamboanga. What I will be sharing here is the experience of Tacloban, that's my organization, in implementing a housing project that builds not only houses but is communities. The closest experience we had to disasters was when we were flooded in October and after the guerra that happened in September. It was mentioned by Maria earlier, no? It was on September 9, almost 2 years. So, Katilingban is a Cebuano term that means community. And earlier there was a discussion, how do we define community? Is it according to geographical, is it according to geographical location? Is it according to the government structure? Or is it communities of people and then communities of the different persons in a certain community according to sector? So this is a map that shows where Zamboanga is and in the context of Mindanao. And I'm showing this map to just illustrate that Zamboanga City has 98 barangays. Its population is about almost 1,800,000. It's composed of Muslims and Christians, Sambogenyo, Bisaya, Tausug, Yakan, and Sama. And then in the early 70s, 80s, migration started. People coming from the other neighboring countries to seek better opportunities economically and also because they wanted to escape or avoid being caught in the conflict, both in certain areas in Mindanao and also the Visayas and also Colong and Basilan. So the migrants would stay with their relatives, and there are those who would rent houses, others live in open spaces. And these people, the migrants, provided labor for the industries in Zamboanga, which includes fishing. Zamboanga City is the sardines capital of the Philippines. So my organization was established in 1996. It was primarily to address the needs of these migrants who settled in different areas in the city. We worked with community associations. We started with one community association, those that we call urban poor or the squatters. And then we moved on to working with 16 community associations. I'd like to differentiate between communities and community associations because community associations are people, composed of people who came together, organized themselves into associations, and went to us to seek assistance for strengthening organizational development, for livelihood, for health. But there was one unmet need, and I will go to that later, and housing was unmet need. Tacloban is a member of the Zamboanga Basilan Integrated Development Alliance. And these are the other members of the alliance that reach out to others foundation whose focus is on sustainable agriculture, working with rural and upland farmers. Peace Advocates Zamboanga, which works on with different communities, barangays, including schools, and it's focused in advocating for peace. Nagilaab Foundation is an organization that works in Basilan. It also works that focuses in governance, environment, and Nagilaab Foundation is the only organization in the Sabida that has direct experience responding to humanitarian crisis as a result of armed conflict. So these are the things that we are doing together and separately as members of the Sabida. So the housing project. Initially, because in the early 90s, 1996, people were asking us for help. How can we have houses in the context of Zamboanga? When people went to the government, they will always be answered, we don't have funds for that. But then also realized that there really was no program for people who were migrants or considered outsiders of Zamboanga. And no matter if they are providing cheap labor for the different industries, they were still considered outsiders in a problematic sector. And aside from that, there also was no land banking, there was no plan at all to address the issue of informal sectors. The housing backlog of Zamboanga City as of November 2014 is pegged at 24,000. And Tacloban, the rest of the Vida has worked with 600 households and only a drop in the bucket. But what I'd like to emphasize here is that there was never any plan to address the issue of informal sectors. There is the CMP, but if you ask where the people will be brought, I am quite naive or
amazed at the experience of Chris Rollo's presentation. The government was ready to provide land, I think. Am I correct? But in the case of Zamboanga, we didn't have land that was available for even the CMP process. So it was that. So the housing project, and suddenly one of the members of the association said, why don't we do it ourselves? But how do we do it ourselves when we don't have enough resources? But later we realized that we had friends, and these are the friends that we have, no? The housing project was a concerted effort of local organizations like the Tacloban and the community associations with a lot of help from agencies in Spain, Manos Unidas and the Cooperation Agency of Spain. It was also a concerted effort of individuals and communities and academia. We had people from the local state university, engineers, peace advocates, the Office of the Social Concerns, Office of the University, social scientists who helped us in the project, line agencies, not necessarily the local government unit, but line agencies who were open to helping us train livelihood, livelihood organizing, and even social needs, like for example the DSWD, the Department of Labor and Employment. So there were these were the livelihoods that helped us. There were two main components. One was a technical component. It includes site development. You construct the road, you construct the houses. But more importantly, is the social component, which involves the selection process, social preparation, and continuing organizational development. When I say selection process, community associations would have like 50 members, 20 members, 60 members, coming from different barangays in the city center of Zamboanga. They develop the criteria themselves. Who needs the house? What is the need based on? Does this mean that some people are already ready for eviction, where they already have received eviction notices? Or are these people whose houses were burned because they thought that they need to live? One also is the attitude. Are they willing to work for the houses? Things like that. Are they willing to help in looking for the land? Because the land, as I mentioned earlier, was a big issue, and we had to buy the land ourselves. But we also know that because these people work as vendors, cargador in the pantalan, factory workers, the land that we had to choose, where they would transfer later on, had to be accessible to where their main income generating activities are. So that was part of the social aspect. Social preparation included learning sessions, whether on-site, like this is one area where members of different associations went to determine if this land would be bought for the housing sites, or we had access to some government buildings like the schools, for example, where they would have meetings. The learning sessions would include several things. Would include several topics. At the onset, especially the first 2-3 housing projects, one very important learning session was how to do basic carpentry work, because the people were expected to provide sweat equity. Kathleen one provided for the materials for the core house. The members themselves would provide sweat equity and the other materials that they would need to finish the house. To finish the house at the end of 2 or 3 years, because some houses were not finished immediately, while some houses were finished in a shorter time because they had available resources, including the time to construct it. Part of the social purpose gender organization, because it was very important for us to identify who does what in the family and who does what in the organizations that we have. part of the learning sessions was the culture of peace sessions. Why we're saying this, as mentioned earlier, they come from different community associations. They speak different languages. They have different, as community